Hello and welcome to this episode of the Christopher Hall Training Podcast. Today's topic is low back weakness doesn't cause low back pain. It's a topic that I've been talking about lately. It's also a topic that I get a lot of questions on, and what I'm going to do is try and answer some of those questions. And if you do have any further questions about anything I'm about to say, pop them down in the comment section below and I'll do my best to answer them. But for now, let's get into it. In part one, I want to talk about why muscles don't always cause pain, and in some respects try and describe the real cause of low back pain. It's kind of where the buck stops. Now, there are different ones, different real causes, if you will. And I'm going to use the example of sciatica because there are different causes, or there are different tissues that can create the pain, but all of the symptoms are very similar in that pain will go into the buttocks and down the leg. They could just go to the buttocks, they could just go to the knee, they could go all the way down to the ankle and the foot. So that's sort of the first thing that we need to understand, is that the symptoms are very similar, but the tissue could be different, and then we can further talk about the cause. So if we start with the first one, which is a disc bulge. So a disc bulge can give you sciatic symptoms, i.e. symptoms that come from the sciatic nerve. So the bulge touches the nerve, it irritates it, and then the irritation goes down the leg. Now the disc bulge, that could take, depending on who you read and where you read, that could take 2 to 8 weeks to resolve itself, for the pain to reduce. So what will happen is the bulge will sort of go back into the disc, if you will. But what we have to look at is, how did the disc get to that situation in the first place, and what's happening to the disc? So when a bulge occurs, it's not, as a general rule, it's generally not down to one moment. So that moment when the back went, or you had that episode of pain, it wasn't just that moment that did it. It was a build-up. It has been described as the straw that broke the camel's back. So there is I'm going to describe it as a fatiguing of tissues, if you will. Now, we're talking about the disc. So if you can imagine, that's an intervertebral disc. You're looking down at the top of it. So you've got a gel-like fluid in the middle, and then you've got, I guess, a bit like rings of a tree around it. Now, what the idea of those two tissues is, you get flexibility from the gel-like fluid, but you get the rigidity of the rings. So you've got a tissue that is able to be flexible and strong. That's the purpose of those two tissues. Now, how the disc bulge occurs is the gel-like fluid in the middle migrates its way through the rings of the disc, or the rings of the tree. Now, how does it do that? Well, it's done via a process described as delamination. So the rings are very tightly packed together, or they are sort of optimized, if you will. They're not too tightly packed together, but they're not too loose. Because if they were too tight, they'd be too rigid. If they were too loose, they'd be too flexible. Now, the delamination basically creates more space, and it allows the fluid to migrate. So this is the fatiguing process. It's the migration of it. So the fluid migrates, or not the fluid, the gel-like material migrates its way through the layers, and then eventually it bulges. Now, what does that? So I guess you could say this is sort of one of the real causes of low back pain. Well, it's a flexion and extension cycle, and the repeated flexion extension cycle. And it's sped up under load. So the more load you put on, so if you keep bending the spine back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, the more you do that, the more this delamination process will occur. And then what will then start to happen is the fluid will migrate. If you then add load on top of that, then the process will happen that bit quicker. So one of the causes is sort of flexion extension cycles, which fatigue the fibrous material and allows the gel-like fluid to sort of go through. Now, as I've mentioned, another sort of real cause would be a genetic one. Now, I don't like to put too much emphasis on genetics because it's very hard to know someone's genetics as to that was the cause. It was your genetics that caused it. But it is a real thing. And it's all to do with, it's all to do with a part of the genetic makeup. One is the disc shape. The other is the amount of collagen that's within the disc. So some people will have more collagen, which will slow the process. Some people will have less collagen, which will speed the process up, if that makes sense. But until you actually look at the disc and identify that genetics was the cause, it's very hard to say it was the cause. So it's much more relevant to talk about the use of the spine as the real cause, although genetics do play their part. So there is a genetic element and an epigenetic element, let's say. Now, I've said that depending on who you listen to or who you read or where you get your information, people will say 2 to 8 weeks and the bulge will resolve itself. So it will sort of, the fluid will sort of push back in. But now there is an inherent weakness because the fibres haven't gone back to the way they were. That's not essentially how they work. So they're not going to go back to sort of the default prior to the first bulge. So what happens, or what can happen now, is, and let's just say that was at L5, L4. So you've got the base of the spine, which is S1, L5. Then you've got the L5 disc, and then you've got the intervertebral disc, L5, L4, with L4 sat on the top. So let's just say it was at L4, L5 vertebra. So you've got one disc below, and obviously you've got many up above. And let's just say the one below is fine, and the one above is fine. So these two discs, above and below, have their integrity. So they are as plump as they were before. But the one in between isn't as plump because the disc bulge has happened and the delamination of the fibres has occurred. So what you now have is an inherent instability in that segment because of that disc, because of those movements or genetics that created the disc to be that way. So the real cause of the disc being that way was the loaded movement, or the cycles of loaded movement that build up over time and then eventually give you the disc bulge. You also have the genetic element factor to it as well, which I'm not going to ignore. But what happens is this disc now is not as stable as the one above it and the one below it. So between the L4 and the L5 disc, it can now move a lot more because the disc isn't as plump and it doesn't have the rigidity to it. So now there is this inherent instability. So this is where we can start talking about muscle weakness. So the muscles are responding to that instability in the disc. So it is not the muscles that are inherently weak. It is not the muscles that are inherently the problem. They are trying to deal with a situation which has been created. So they may become tight. They may sort of lock into position. So there may be a lot of tension in there. So you may not be able to move it very far, and you may not be able to get a lot of sort of extra contraction out of it. So we have to understand the muscles from that perspective. They aren't driving the problem. It's something to do with the spine. Now, they can become tight for other reasons, and I want to go through two more types of injury that can cause sciatic pain. So we've got foraminal stenosis, and that is basically the narrowing of the hole that the nerve comes through. So if that narrows because bone gets laid down, it's going to be much quicker to irritate the nerve because the hole isn't. So as you move your spine, as you bend down and pick something up, as you extend up to lift over your head, because the hole isn't as wide, it's going to irritate. It's going to be quicker to irritate. Now, there is no real healing of this. With regards to the disc, as we've said, that can sort of 2 to 8 weeks, that can resolve itself. It doesn't mean the disc is healed, but it means that the pain has resolved itself. The fluid has gone back in. With regards to the stenosis, and these can be arthritic changes to the bone. So again, it's like it's a wear and tear to it, which it can be a natural part of aging. But that natural part of aging can be sped up with the improper use of the spine. And that, again, that's a multi-dimensional, multifactorial answer as well. But I'm not going to go too far down that rabbit hole because I've been talking long enough on this. There is no real sort of solution to the stenosis apart from management. There is also facet joint arthrosis, which is a similar thing. It's a wear and tear. It's an improper use of the spine. That again, the facet joints, if you can imagine, you've got the barrel of the disc, the barrel of the vertebra, and then you've got the 3 sort of prongs that one comes straight off the back and then 2 sort of come diagonally out the side. Those are known as the spinous process out the back and the 2 transverse processes out the side. Between those transverse processes, there is a joint which allows them to slide over each other as you flex and extend the spine and rotate and things like that. So if those joints become inflamed, they can have then arthritic changes, then you get your facet joint arthrosis. Again, there is no real sort of healing for that. You can obviously have surgery to open the hole out for the stenosis, and you can have the surgery on the facet joints as well. Obviously, that's not ideal. That's not what a lot of people go for, but pain can be managed, and in some respects, pain can be resolved. It just means, which I'll talk about in the final part, but I want to get back to the muscles, which I'm going to talk about in part 2. But this is just building some building blocks, because as that healing or resolving of pain is taking place, muscles are changing how they manage the stability of the spine. Because there is, when you look at S1, L5, L4, L3, L2, L1, there's no bony structures to hold it in place. So the muscles have to do that job of holding it in place. So if there is a perceived problem or a perceived instability at any of those segments, S1, L5, L5, L4, L4, L3, so on and so forth, the body will try and manage that. And it will use tightness to be able to do that. Now, there will be a degree of what's called muscle guarding. So a lot of the problem has resolved itself, but the muscles are still holding on tight. But as I've mentioned, if there is an inherent instability in the spine because the disc has become a little bit more lax and it's not as plump as the one above it and below it, it will hold that segment tight because you have the QL muscle that joins L5, L4, L3, L2, L1. You've got the psoas muscle which joins onto L5, L4, L3, L2, L1, T12 and into the diaphragm. So they are muscles directly stabilizing the vertebra. So they will become, or they can become, tight. And that's not because they're tight, that's because they're responding to a problem. So what I'm saying is muscle tightness and muscle weakness is a symptom of a problem at the spine. If we can manage the problem at the spine and create more stability through the muscles for the spine, then we can start solving the problem. Now, what I'm going to talk about more is I've started to build a picture of why weakness is just a symptom. What I'm going to do now in part number 2 is talk a little bit more about weakness as the symptom, and I'm going to talk more directly about the muscles that are, or what's happening within the muscles. And there's 2 components of the muscles that we're going to talk about that will, again, hopefully help you understand why weakness isn't a symptom of low back pain. And just a quick correction, why weakness isn't a cause of low back pain. It's a symptom. And it's the same as tightness at of those muscles as well. Now, it comes down to 2 parts to the muscle. So we have the muscle structure. So we have the muscle itself. We then have bundles that make up the muscle called fasciculi. And then we have muscle fibers that make up the fasciculi. And then we have the muscle cell, so the contractile portion, the sarcomere, which make up the muscle fiber. So we have the smallest part, which is the sarcomere, which is made up of the actin and myosin, which is the contractile proteins. They are laid back to back, and we get a muscle fiber. We get a bundle of muscle fibers called a fasciculi, and then we get a bundle of fasciculi, and we call that the entire muscle. At each level, there are also like a fascial wrapping of it, like cling film. So around the entire muscle, you get the epimysium. Around the fasciculi, you get the perimysium, and then you have the endomysium. So there's your that's essentially the structure of your muscle. What you then have is the nerve that comes in and innervates that muscle and activates it, as an example. But one nerve doesn't activate the whole muscle. There are lots of nerves coming in, activating a selection of muscle fibers. And this is where we need to start understanding, because as I've mentioned, around the muscle fiber, which is a very small part of the muscle, if you can imagine a spring and it's coiled like that, that wraps around the muscle fiber. And what that's doing, like a spring, when you pull it apart, you pull the coil apart and you get the gaps. And then when you let it goes back and there's no gaps. So you have this thing in your muscle called a muscle spindle. And it's detecting length change. So as your muscle gets longer, it detects that. As your muscle gets shorter, it detects that. So with regards to muscle tightness, a reason a muscle becomes chronically tight is because of the neuromuscular system. It's your brain telling your muscle, don't go any further because there's a problem. So what happens is when you stretch a muscle, your brain kicks in and says, no more. And it holds it in that place. So that's one component. The second component is what's called a Golgi tendon organ. Now, the Golgi tendon organ sits in the tendon of the muscle. And this is kind of the second part of what a muscle does. So you've got the muscle spindle that detects changes in length. The Golgi tendon organ detects changes in force. And what that means is just like a fuse box. So imagine what a fuse box does for an appliance or for the house. If there's too much electricity going in, it just cuts it out and shuts it down. So certainly in rehab, a lot of muscle weakness is your Golgi tendon organ shutting the muscle down. So you can do as much strengthening as you like, you won't get full strength gains. You have to override the neuromuscular system. So the reason muscle weakness is a symptom of low back pain is because your brain has perceived a problem, which could be the instability in two vertebrae because there's laxity in a disc. So your brain knows that's there. And what your brain is doing is saying, I don't want any more force going through this part of my body because it may cause more problems further down the line. So what it does is it creates a degree of tension to hold it in place. And then if you try to create more tension, i.e. more strength in the area, it just shuts it down. Now, you can add strength to that. The muscles around it will become stronger if you keep strengthening it. But what you've got is that shaky foundation or weak foundation underneath it. What's more advantageous is to start thinking about the proper solution, which is number one, essentially it's learning to override the neuromuscular system, essentially. Because if you can do that, you can override the Golgi tendon organ and the muscle spindle. So tight muscles, in some respects, are dictated by the muscle spindle not being allowed to be stretched any further because the brain's saying no further. But also the Golgi tendon organ is doing the same for strength. So tightness and weakness are both symptoms of a problem in an area. So again, you can stretch and you can strengthen as much as you like. But if you don't address the actual problem, which is what we talked about in part number 1, which is the proper use of the area, so you have to create proper use in the area, that will then help the body realise, okay, we haven't got a problem here anymore. Now, there will be a degree of muscle guarding, which is your body just guarding. Just the problem could be completely gone, but there will still be a perception in the brain, unconsciously, that there's a problem there, and the muscles will guard against it. So that could be there as well. Or it could be there and there is no problem there. That could also be a scenario. But what we have to do is we have to release that tension. So we have to start using the spine more effectively. And what we're going to do in part number 3 is start talking about what that solution is. And hopefully it will help people understand that muscle weakness isn't the cause and muscle strength isn't the solution. So the solution to low back pain is, first of all, stop irritating a tissue. So we've talked about a disc bulge, we've talked about foraminal stenosis, and we've talked about facet joint arthrosis, which to the facet joint arthrosis and the disc bulge, there are definite movement causes to it, or influences to those injuries. So if you move your spine in a certain way, you can create a disc bulge and you can create a facet joint arthrosis. They are multifactorial, so there are more elements than one. So when you hear someone say that a deadlift didn't cause your disc bulge or your disc herniation, there may be some truth in that, but it will play its part. And that's something that we need to come to terms with. And that's something that the industry needs to come to terms with, is that movement, be it everyday movement or movement in a gym, if done incorrectly, will wear down a joint, which will eventually create an injury. So the solution. So we've talked about a disc. We've talked about a foramen, which is the hole where the nerve comes out. And we've talked about the facet joint. So if the facet joint is inflamed, we need to stop irritating that tissue. If the disc is bulging and irritating the nerve, we need to stop irritating that tissue. If the stenosis is irritating the nerve, we need to stop irritating that tissue with our movement. So all three of them, there is a movement solution, not a muscle strength solution. Because muscle strength won't help you when it comes to a disc bulge. Because it's the movement that minimizes, or that can either maximize, depending on the movement that you do, can either maximize a disc bulge or it can minimize a disc bulge. Now, again, a part of that will be how close are you to that injury. So if it happened yesterday, it's probably not going to be a good idea, if it was a disc bulge, that you then go about bending your spine. I mean, in all honesty, you probably won't be able to anyway. The body won't let you bend your spine. You'll be stuck in a rigid position anyway. Now, the further and further away you get, the more applicable it is to start moving the spine and bringing back proper movement. But again, it needs to be done in a certain way. So step one was stop irritating the tissue with improper movement and misuse of the spine. Now, as we talked about with the disc bulge, as a general rule, it's flexion extension cycles sped up if we add load on top. Now again, as I mentioned, the closer you are to the injury, the more pertinent it's going to be to not flex and bend the spine. The further away you get, you've got more license to. But when I then talk about number two, you've got to get the muscles working properly. So there is a process to this. It's not just about jumping into the deep end and going, my spine is meant to move, my spine was built to move, therefore I am going to move it. There is a process to it. 100% full range of movement will come further down the line, and we'll get to that. So the people that are movement activists or promoters will get there. It's just as the injury has happened, we've got to get the muscles working properly. So number one, we've got to override these tight and tense muscles. So we've got to override the neuromuscular system, as we've talked about. So we need to start consciously bracing the spine. We need to start holding the spine in a proper position. We need to start using the hips correctly. So when we go down to lift, hinging from the hips. Now I understand that everyday life, we're never going to be able to pick up all of our objects, boxes, pens, clothes, laundry baskets, going down into cupboards with a neutral spine. I get it. I'm not telling people to be robots. But what we have to do is we have to teach people to hip hinge. We have to teach people to brace. And when I mean bracing, it's bracing appropriately. If it's a heavy task, we need to brace heavy. If it's a light task, we need to brace lightly. This will help our body realize that we're using our body properly. Because if we go down to pick something up heavy and we don't brace our torso, your body will brace itself. And it will generally use the muscles around the spine to do it. That is when we get our painful catches of the muscle when it goes, because it may perceive that there is a problem that's going to occur or that a problem is occurring. And therefore the body will spasm and it will create that problem. So we need to get the muscles working properly. If there is tension there, we need to try and release that tension with massage, with foam rolling. Now again, the depth and intensity of the massage will depend on, again, the intensity of the pain and where they are with regards to when the injury happened, and is it the day after, a week after, a month after. All of that has to be understood. So it's not a blanket, get a massage, get down in there, be intense, loads of pain, but the tension will be released. That's not the case. It depends on the individual. Once we've got all of that happening, so once we've managed the movement, so we're not irritating the tissue anymore. We've got muscles working more effectively because we're learning some basic skills of how to protect our spine, i.e. bracing, neutral spine, hip hinge, as an example. What we then need to do is build capacity. And building capacity isn't just about building strength. And strength doesn't equal pain-free, as I've described. The steps before will reduce pain. What we are now doing is we are now building protection around it. We aren't in a sort of a reduction of pain, initial pain phase. We are now in a minimization of risk phase. So we need to build the capacity of the core muscles and of the torso to cope with the rigors of everyday life. Be that also if you go to the gym. So we have to start building the tissues. Now, again, as I've mentioned, we don't just want to build strength. We want to build endurance and we want to build stability. Strength is the initial contraction strength. Then we need to get that going at the right time. That's your stability. So we need to get the muscles to fire at the right time or to enhance their contraction at the right time and dampen their contraction at the right time. That's your stability. The strength is the heightening of the activity and the stronger the initial contraction. So we've got stability, we've got strength. Then we need to do that over a prolonged period of time, which is the endurance. So we need all of those to be working. We also need all of those to be working all around the torso. So the low back, the sides, and the abdominal wall at the front. Because what knits that whole area together is the abdominal fascia or the thoracolumbar fascia or the torso fascia, if you want to call it that. In textbooks, you'll see thoracolumbar fascia or lumbodorsal fascia and abdominal fascia. It's basically the same thing. When your muscles are balanced and they are contracting evenly around the torso, you have an even distribution of stress around the torso, which is minimizing it on the spine. And this is what we need to create. Then we just need to put the endurance on the top of it. And it's that that's going to protect our core, because it's the endurance that allows us to maintain our strength and maintain our stability. So we want to be building endurance into the torso. But we also don't want to forget what we were doing before, which is using the spine properly. Now, again, as I mentioned, the further away you get from the episode of pain, the more license you have to move and bend your spine. So it's about using your spine correctly for the stage of rehabilitation or fitness that you are at. It's not a simple case of do a bunch of strength exercises and you'll be fine, because the common response I find to that is I got really strong, but my pain didn't change. So it's being able to get the pain to change, then put the strength in. Because all you're doing, if you strengthen your lower back, is you are putting strength on a weak foundation. And eventually, that strength doesn't really mean anything. So that is why I say low back weakness doesn't cause low back pain. What's causing low back pain is the improper use of the spine and the improper rehabilitation of the spine. And what's much more effective is to be able to stop irritating the tissues, get the muscles working properly to override that neuromuscular system, and then start building capacity, which is the stability, the strength, and then eventually the endurance. So hopefully that gives you a better idea of why low back weakness is just a symptom of lower back pain. Again, if you have comments, leave them below. If you like what you've heard, hit the like button. If you've learned something new, hit the thanks button. And if you want to watch more tutorials like this, please do hit the subscribe button and the bell icon.